Good morning, everybody. And I'm going to put a disclaimer before this talk, which is it's a talk that starts really depressing and it gets better. So first of all, hang in there, not necessarily because you're interested in me, but because the conversation that we're going to have with Mohammed and Aurora afterwards will be really, really good. So even if you just have to suffer through me, you'll get there. But this is a conversation that starts talking about images, and talking about images that capture moments in time. And I want to make the argument that this image of Alan Kurdi, taken on a beach in Turkey late last year, is this sort of image that's going to get locked in our minds. It's going to be an image that ends up reminding us of this particular moment of the refugee crisis in Syria, where you've had more than 4 million people displaced out of the country, more than 6 million people internally displaced in the country, and this horrific situation of countries around the world trying to figure out what we should do with desperate people who want to come to our shores, and the real tragedy of families so desperate to, in this case, get out of Turkey and get reunited with family in Canada, that you had a family that made 3 tries to leave Turkey for a Greek island, and it ended up very tragically. But this is an image that ended up seared into people's heads, and you could see it got picked up by folks like Ai Weiwei, who ended up putting himself in the same position, by activists in Palestine who used the image not only to talk about Syrian refugees, but other people who feel trapped where they are, by an anonymous graffiti artist who ended up using the image of Alan Kurdi outside the European Central Bank to talk about the ways in which Europe's policies end up being implicated around the refugee situation. But the reason I'm starting with this really powerful and painful image is that I've been trying to think about this question: who do we listen to when we think about Syrian refugees? And I've been asking my friends who work on Syria, who do we listen to? Who's been the spokesperson for this very large group of people who are at the center of our news right now? And this is the only person I've been able to come up with. We have not found a particularly good way to listen to these millions of people who are in such dire straits. And you can see this in some ways. This is an analysis that we did over at MIT with a tool that we call Media Cloud. Media Cloud basically tries to suck in as many news stories as we can and then does analysis on top of it. And when you look at people in American and European media talking about the refugee crisis, we end up with 2 peaks over the last year. And one of them is actually a peak around Alan Kurdi's death. But when you look at who we talk about when we talk about refugees, we don't talk about people. We talk about nations, we talk about leaders, we don't talk about individuals. It's very hard to find the individual who's going to be able to tell us the story of what it's like to have your country be in such desperate straits that the best that you can do for your family is to find a way out of it. So I want to make 2 arguments here. The first argument is that Alan Kurdi has ended up becoming the spokesperson for Syrian refugees, which is ironic because he's both 3 years old and dead. And the second thing I want to argue is that when we talk about Syria, what we actually talk is about what it means for us. What it means as Europeans, what it means as Americans, what it means as people in the global north dealing with desperate people coming from the global south. And again, if we look at the media, you can see how this plays out. This is the worst thing you can do in a presentation, by the way, is show giant graphs that no one can read. But what these giant graphs that no one can read would show you, if you looked at them closely, is that when we look at what we talk about when we talk about Syrian refugees, we almost never talk about the countries where the refugees are actually going. We talk very little about Turkey. We talk very little about Jordan. We talk an enormous amount about Germany and about Hungary. When we're having these conversations, these are conversations about what refugees mean to us. They're not conversations about what's actually happening to the people. And this is the overall argument that I want to try to make with you, which is that we're at this really interesting moment in time. We are hitting a moment in time in which we are going to very soon end up with between 9 and 12 billion people on the planet. These are the projections from the UN Population Division. This is what's called an 80% probability curve. If you look at those dotted lines there, that's basically their area of 80% certainty. They're 80% certain that we'll have somewhere between 9 and 12 billion people on the planet by 2100. Given trends in health, given trends in life extension, some of us may be lucky enough to be part of that 9 to 12 billion. And one thing that I can safely predict about this 9 to 12 billion is that they will be highly self-documenting. They will be making media, they will be taking selfies, they will be making videos, they will be putting them out into the world. As we head towards 2100, we're going to have this incredible, unprecedented capacity to know what's happening in other parts of the world. And I know this is going to happen because this is happening now. If you want to know what young people think in Nigeria, you can find that out to an extent that would have been absolutely impossible 10 years ago. All you really need is a couple of Nigerians in your social network, and you will know, whether you like it or not, what's happening in Nigerian media right now. But the truth is, what is likely to happen is that we are going to end up seeing the world through the lens of what matters to us. What do we already think we know about? What do we already care about? We tend to see the world in terms of what does this mean for me? What does this mean around the people directly around me? And what I want to make an argument here is that this is a deeply counter-evolutionary strategy. And the reason for that is that we are connected to one another around the world to an absolutely unprecedented degree. The things that we rely on for daily life, and unfortunately the clicker is part of my daily life, but whether it's the chairs that you're sitting on, whether it's the clothes that you're wearing, these are atoms that have come from anywhere around the world. There's a very good chance that a lot of them are from China, but they're certainly coming from tens of thousands of kilometers around the globe before you're interacting with them today. Even if you're the sort of person who doesn't buy things, you're interacting with people, and those people are coming from everywhere. We have managed to create a travel network, an air network, that is literally bringing together people from all over the globe, and we end up discovering how much this matters at moments of epidemic, at something like SARS suddenly coming and everyone realizing that it actually turns out that China and Canada turn out to be functionally next to one another. There's an enormous amount of travel that sort of comes back and forth between the two. When we start worrying about things like Ebola spreading, we suddenly become very sensitive to the ways in which we're all connected. But there's a major way in which we're not connected, and that's around digital information and digital data. And it's not that we can't be connected. If you are a Nigerian living in the Netherlands, this is an unprecedented time. You can watch Nollywood movies. You can make VoIP phone calls. You can functionally live in Abuja while living in Rotterdam. And it's very easy, and actually a lot of people do end up doing this. So if you are a displaced person, whether you're a refugee or whether you're an economic migrant, this is an unprecedented opportunity to be in two places at the same time. But if you are, like me, a stupid monocultural American, you are probably quite trapped by a force called homophily. Now, homophily is one of these words that you're probably not going to see outside of a sociology textbook, but it's a very helpful word. Homophily is probably the best demonstrated tendency in sociology. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies that basically prove that birds of a feather flock together. If we walk into a room and sort ourselves, we will unconsciously end up sitting next to people who are like us. We will find ways to sit next to people who have the same religion, who have the same ethnicity, who have the same income or socioeconomic status. People have done experiments that show when you release students into a computer lab People with glasses will sit next to other people with glasses. People with long hair will sit next to other people with long hair. We are amazingly good at this. And when you sit down and ask people, why did you end up there? Why did you sort yourself that way? Everyone says the same thing. They said, that person looked nice. But that tendency to find the person who looks nice tends to mean that our communities end up segregated, tends to make sure that our circles of friends end up segregated. And one of the really interesting things is it has led to the fact that the internet has ended up segregated. So here are 3 ways that we tend to find information online. You can think of this almost as a progress between these sort of 3 steps. The early internet, back in those halcyon golden days of the 1990s and the early 2000s, the internet was really dominated by these big news brands, folks like the New York Times, folks like The Guardian, really well-considered, carefully curated content. We then ended up in this middle period where suddenly no one wanted gatekeepers, no one wanted curators. We all wanted to know exactly what we wanted to know. And we're now at this strange period of social media where we know that what we want to know just isn't that interesting. What we actually want to know is what all of our friends know. And that's what social is all about, is trying to figure out what is it that our friends know that we don't know yet. So here's the trick with these gatekeepers. These gatekeepers are getting less global and more local over time. This may be more dramatic in the United States because we're a crazed imperial power that really doesn't give a crap about anybody else, but it's actually happening in a lot of other places as well. The UK, we see some of the very same statistics. We're seeing less and less focus on international news, more and more focus on local. And there's 2 reasons for it. It's much cheaper to produce local news, and people like it more. So international news has 2 huge strikes against it. It costs a fortune to make, and people don't pay attention to it. And so we have this very strange phenomenon. It used to be really, really hard to report on the rest of the world. When the US was involved with Vietnam, we would report by going out and shooting film on big, heavy cameras on people's shoulders. We would take undeveloped rolls of film, hand them to the stewardess who was flying from Vietnam through 2 stops in the Pacific, ending in LA, where it would then get developed, and then it would actually end up being put on the TV 2 or 3 days later. On these days, we can put camera crews anywhere in the world broadcasting over the internet within a few hours. And we still spend about 1/3 as much time on that international news as we did on the domestic news. But here's the funny thing. When you give us the choice of who we want to pay attention to, what we want to learn about, we demonstrate this overwhelming bias for the local. This is Mark Zuckerberg's favorite image. Now that you've seen it, I invite you to look for this image in coverage of Facebook. This was probably the best summer internship ever. Paul Butler was a student intern with Facebook for the summer of 2010, produced this as a visualization of where Facebook users were in the world and how they connect to one another. And of course, what this map says to you is that Facebook is at the center of this intricately connected network that connects everybody in the world. So that's the rhetoric of the image. Now start picking it apart. A couple of things to notice. There's no China, right? And there hasn't been on Facebook, and there still isn't, despite the fact that Zuckerberg has learned how to speak Mandarin. There's no Russia. Russians don't particularly like Facebook. They use VKontakte. It works just fine. There's not a lot of Africa. And this suddenly takes us to the fact that we still have real digital divides. But the part that I want you to look at are those parts that are lit up bright white. And the reason they're lit up bright white is that the connections that we make within our own local communities so massively overwhelm these international connections that there's no possible way you could put it on a map. And this is what Facebook tries to do. When you sign up for Facebook, and frankly, when you sign up for any social network this day, what they try to do is reinforce your existing ties. Facebook says, hey, let's find your friends. Let me start by mining your email. So I'm going to find the people that you're in touch with already. Then let's go back in history. Where did you go to high school? How about primary school? How about uni? And all of these places are places that end up being separated demographically. And so you end up rebuilding this network of the people who you already know. And these people are already special to you. You already have relationships. You already care about them. Now, Facebook could do something very different. Facebook could say, what are you interested in? I'm really interested in international development. I'm really interested in technology and social change. I would love to meet some people in Nigeria or some people in Singapore who care about those things. And in fact, that's how we used to build the web pre-1995. That's what Usenet was all about. We used to meet people based on our interests. But now we meet them based on proximity. And when Facebook looks at who's friends with who, even internationally, we get locked by language, we get locked by geography. This is a graph that looks at Facebook friendships, and you'll see that yellow line down the middle. That's showing you that everybody has a vast majority of friends from the same country. But then we end up with clusters. People in Scandinavia know other people in Scandinavia. People in Latin America know other people in Latin America. We tend to be enormously local. We tend to be locked by culture and locked by language. These tools right now have incredible potential to open the globe to us, and that's not how we're using them, because that's not how they've been set up. Here's why this matters. The big stuff, climate change, international pollution, pandemic disease, these are going to be global problems. We're only going to solve them from a global perspective. There's no way to meaningfully address climate change if you can't address the totally legitimate desires of 1 billion Chinese people and 1 billion Indian people to have a great life like the lives we all enjoy here in this room. So we've got to have a conversation that's international. But right now, these conversations are hyper-local. Here's how the US reported Ebola. We barely talked about it until it showed up in Texas when a nurse came back, and suddenly everyone went, oh my God, Ebola around the corner, we're all gonna die. And suddenly becomes the biggest story in US media. But when Ebola is actually killing poor people in Africa, it's basically a footnote. But there's less depressing reasons to care about this. Even for you guys who are sitting there and trying to figure out startups, there's reasons to care about this. It's an amazing paper by this guy, Ron Burt, one of the best sociologists out there. Burt ends up studying Raytheon, this giant US defense contractor, and he asks a really simple question. Who has good ideas? He gets ideas from 1,500 people around the company. He has the CEO and the senior management anonymously rank these ideas. Who had an idea that could transform our company? He finds one really simple thing. If you are at a bridge in the network, if you are someone who works with people in lots of different offices, preferably in lots of different companies, if you are someone who ends up being a connector to different parts of the social network, you are at high risk of good ideas. And the way this works is very straightforward. If you are one of these high-risk people, you have the chance to import an idea from another part of the company and bring it to a context where it might be differently appreciated. And this turns out to be a strategy that we've seen in great art. When Picasso invents Cubism, it's not an accident that he fills his studio with West African masks for 5 years before he starts taking those same shapes. He's imported a way of looking at the world, and he's brought it into a very different context. I want to try to make this really easy for people. So here's one super simple thing you can do. Go read this website. I helped found this 12 years ago. It's called Global Voices. It's a website run by 1,400 volunteers. They're under the leadership of my dear friend Mohammed Nanabe, who's going to be on stage with me shortly. He's the chair of the board of the nonprofit that runs this. It is an amazing resource for citizen media around the world. And this community every day goes online and tries to figure out what are people talking about in Bangladesh? What are they talking about in Botswana? And when we find it, we translate it from 40 different languages into 30 different languages, but we do two other things. We bridge, we try to explain what this story means, not just to a local context, but what it might mean to you. And we try to discover the pieces that are going to challenge the way that you look at the world. And so when there's a brutal set of killings in Lahore, Pakistan, a set of bombings specifically aimed at Christian families going out and enjoying the Easter holiday, we don't just focus on the horror of it, we focus on the amazing phenomenon of Muslim Pakistanis flooding Lahore's hospitals to donate blood because they wanted to give the message, as one blogger writes, that you can't defeat us and that today Muslim blood is going to flow in Christian bodies. We want to show you these stories. We want to give you the chance to look at the world in a different way. I love the fact that it's so serious that when you get the stop sign here, it stops you from advancing your slides. I want you to do three things. I want you to look for cases where you can help people tell their stories. Whether that means meeting refugees in your community, whether it means reaching out to people from other cultures, help people figure out how to get these stories out in the world. Demand from the media that you read that you get different information, different ways of looking at the world. And for those of you who build technology, don't build another goddamn app to help us find a restaurant. Build us tools that help us discover these different voices, these different ways of looking at the world. I thank you very, very much for this.